Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive. Get comfortable, because we've pulled together some really fascinating information today that zeroes in on something that affects all of us in the digital age, the constantly evolving landscape of cyber threats.
Yeah, it really is evolving fast.
Seriously, trying to stay on top of how quickly things change, from brand new vulnerabilities popping up to the different tactics attackers are using, it feels like a relentless game of whack-a-mole. It's a huge challenge to feel truly informed, but that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive.
It truly is a race, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the pace is only accelerating. One moment, you're dealing with a vulnerability that's been known for a while, maybe patched, and the next, attackers are exploiting something completely new.
Something the software vendor didn't even know about.
Exactly, a zero-day exploit. And then you look at how modern software is built, relying so heavily on code from countless other places, third-party components. You see how a single point of failure introduced early in the process can create massive risk downstream. It's kind of scary.
Right. It's a complex web, for sure. So our mission today is to really unpack the most important knowledge from the information we've been digging into. We're going to explore analyses of the current threat landscape, particularly focusing on some tricky areas like those zero-day vulnerabilities, the growing dangers baked into the software supply chain. And then we'll bring it all together by looking at what happens when these threats actually hit a real organization, specifically a recent and pretty significant data breach that occurred in the healthcare adjacent sector.
Yeah, we've examined reports detailing the latest threat trends, really delved into analyses of specific types of vulnerabilities, gained insights into the tactics of active ransomware groups. We've also reviewed guidance on how organizations should respond to breaches, and we'll spend some time dissecting a specific incident that unfortunately demonstrates the intersection of, well, many of these risks.
Our goal here is to distill all of this down, to give you a much clearer picture of not just where these threats are coming from, but how they are actually playing out in the real world. We want you to finish this deep dive feeling genuinely well-informed on topics that are complex, yeah, but also incredibly relevant and important for understanding today's digital world.
Definitely. And as we prepare to dive into these threats, it's essential to remember that navigating this landscape fundamentally requires strong, resilient security measures.
Yeah.
Having the right foundations.
Yeah, absolutely.
And speaking of foundations, today's deep dive is sponsored by Stonefly. They're a leader in enterprise storage, backup, disaster recovery, AI storage, and cloud solutions.
Right.
When you're talking about defending against ransomware and these sophisticated attacks we're about to discuss, secure storage is just non-negotiable. Stonefly offers critical protections like air-gapped and immutable storage, designed specifically to be ransomware-proof. It's the kind of foundational defense we'll see is absolutely necessary.
Absolutely. Having that kind of secure bedrock in place is step one against the kinds of attacks we're about to discuss. So, if you're looking for that kind of resilience, you can contact Stonefly at sales@stonefly.com to schedule a demo.
Sales@stonefly.com.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're going to start by getting a solid understanding of the current cyber threat landscape, with a particular focus on the healthcare sector, which, unfortunately, has become a major battleground.
Yeah, the data we've seen paints a very clear and honestly concerning picture. Cybersecurity attacks are not declining, they are escalating significantly. And this trend is particularly pronounced when we look at the healthcare sector. Reports indicate this escalation is projected to continue well into 2025.
Really? Into next year already?
Yep. Health ISASEC, that's the organization focused on sharing threat intelligence within the healthcare industry. They recently conducted a survey of healthcare security professionals, and their findings give us some crucial insight into the top concerns.
So, based on that Health ISASEC survey, what did they identify as the most pressing threats right now, and maybe looking ahead to next year?
Okay, so for 2024, the top 5 threats consistently cited were number 1, ransomware, then phishing, compromised credentials, third-party credentials, and general data breaches. Pretty standard list, right?
It's familiar, yeah.
But when those same professionals were asked about their outlook for 2025, the list is strikingly similar, but there's a subtle yet important shift in emphasis. Ransomware deployments are still number 1, no surprise there.
It's a king.
Still king. But then you have third-party breaches moving up, data breaches, supply chain attacks, and zero-day exploits rounding out the top 5.
The consistency suggests certain threats are just, well, ever present, but the slight movement hints that attackers are perhaps refining how they get in or maybe what they target within organizations.
Precisely. While ransomware and data breaches remain persistent and dominant concerns, the The rising prominence of third-party breaches, supply chain attacks, and zero-day exploits on that 2025 list indicates attackers are increasingly focusing on less direct routes into target networks. They're leveraging vulnerabilities in software or services provided by others, or exploiting flaws that nobody even knows are there yet.
And we saw some incredibly impactful real-world examples of this play out in 2024, didn't we? Particularly hitting the healthcare industry hard.
Yes, the reports highlighted several incidents that had widespread repercussions. The Change Healthcare attack back in February 2024, for example, that caused massive disruptions to payment systems and pharmacies across the entire country. It severely impacted healthcare operations and the ability of patients to even get prescriptions filled.
I remember that. It was chaos for a while.
Total chaos. Then, just a few months later, the Ascension Healthcare attack in May 2024 also resulted in significant disruptions, affecting patient care across multiple states and even leading to ambulances being diverted away from affected hospitals.
Wow. Diverting ambulances. That's serious impact.
It really is. And those weren't just isolated incidents affecting one aspect. They caused cascading failures. We also saw a disturbing trend of supply chain attacks, specifically targeting third-party blood suppliers, which obviously has very direct and serious implications for healthcare delivery.
Yeah, you don't want the blood supply chain compromised.
Absolutely not. The materials really emphasize the significant impacts these types of attacks have on healthcare organizations. Survey respondents indicated that the most severe consequences they faced included major disruptions to the normal operation of medical technology, like losing access to electronic health records, EHRs.
Which is critical for patient care.
Totally critical. The severity of unauthorized access to or exposure of protected health information, PHI, was another top concern, alongside the general disruption of overall hospital operations, affecting everything from scheduling appointments and surgeries to internal and external communications.
And PHI is particularly sensitive information, right? We're talking patient medical records, diagnoses. Losing control of that is a huge privacy and security failure.
Absolutely huge. PII, personally identifiable information like names and addresses, that's concerning enough. But PHI includes intimate details about a person's health. Its compromise can have profound impacts.
Okay, let's dig a bit deeper into ransomware then, since it remains stubbornly at the top of these threat lists year after year. The sheer volume seems significant.
Oh, it is. Health ISAC tracked a remarkable 458 ransomware attacks specifically targeting the healthcare sector in 2024 alone.
458 in 1 year. Just healthcare.
Just healthcare. That's an average of more than one attack per day just in this one sector.
That number is staggering. And were certain ransomware groups particularly active in this space? Did the reports name names?
They did. The reports were clear on this. LockBit 3.0 was identified as the most active group targeting healthcare, responsible for 52 documented attacks.
LockBit 3.0.
Following LockBit were groups like INC Ransomware, RansomHub, BianLian, and Quillen. The concentration of attacks from these specific groups suggests they view healthcare as a, lucrative target, perhaps due to the critical nature of the services and the high stakes involved in system downtime. They know these places can't afford to be offline.
Right. They're hitting where it hurts most, hoping for a payout. Beyond just deploying the ransomware itself, what other techniques or tactics did the analysis find attackers using in 2024 to gain access or facilitate these attacks?
Well, social engineering continues to be a major vector. No surprise there either.
Still tricking people.
Yep. This included tactics like targeting help desks, knowing they're often overwhelmed and maybe less security-focused than other departments. We also saw large-scale spam bomb social engineering campaigns designed to just flood targets with messages, hoping some would slip through filters or simply overwhelm the recipient into making a mistake.
Just sheer volume attacks.
Exactly. And there were significant telephone-oriented attack delivery, or TOAD campaigns.
2AD. Okay, what's that?
That's where attackers use phone calls to directly manipulate individuals into performing actions that compromise security, like getting them to install malicious software or reveal their credentials over the phone.
So they're literally calling people up and trying to talk them into giving away access, like classic phone scams, but for corporate networks.
Exactly. It leverages human psychology just as much as technical vulnerabilities. And speaking of technical vulnerabilities, the reports highlighted one specific weakness that was commonly exploited in 2024.
Which one was that?
Remote Desktop Protocol, or RDP, exposure.
RDP. That one comes up a lot.
It does. It was the most commonly observed vulnerability. Health ISAC distributed 105 targeted alerts, specifically warning about exposed RDP services, and issued a strong recommendation for organizations to disable all non-essential RDP access. It's just such a direct connection point into a network that attackers frequently target if it's left unprotected or misconfigured.
So summarizing 2024 and looking ahead to 2025, we're seeing a persistent onslaught of well-known threats like ransomware and social engineering, but crucially, an accelerating move towards attacking organizations indirectly, via third parties, the supply chain, and exploiting vulnerabilities that are newly discovered or even completely unknown.
Which transitions us perfectly into discussing some of these emerging threats, the proactive steps needed to counter them. One topic that's impossible to ignore right now is the role artificial intelligence is beginning to play in attacks.
The AI angle, yes. How are threat actors leveraging AI right now, according to the reports? Is it Skynet time?
Haha, not quite Skynet yet, thankfully. But the materials indicated that AI-enabled attacks are already a primary concern for organizations. And this concern cuts across organizations of all sizes, regardless of their cybersecurity budgets. Everyone's worried about it.
Okay.
AI's current prevalence is particularly notable in how it's enhancing social engineering tactics.
Enhancing social engineering. How so? Making the scams better.
Pretty much. Think about phishing emails. AI can be used to generate highly convincing, grammatically perfect phishing emails at scale. And they can be tailored much more effectively to individual targets by scraping public information from LinkedIn or company websites.
So more personalized spear phishing, basically.
Exactly. And AI can rapidly generate variations of phishing lures to try and bypass detection filters. We're also starting to see the potential for AI-generated deepfakes, audio or video, to be used in these TOE calls or other social engineering campaigns. Imagine getting a video call from your CEO asking for an urgent wire transfer.
Oh, wow. That makes it incredibly difficult to distinguish between a real colleague and an AI-generated imposter asking you to transfer funds or grant access.
It really raises the bar for skepticism. So it's not necessarily creating entirely new attack categories just yet, but it's making existing proven tactics like phishing and social engineering vastly more sophisticated, personalized, and harder to detect. It's an amplification and refinement tool for the bad guys.
That's a great way to put it. It makes the attackers more efficient and their attacks more convincing. Okay, looking further out. Another emerging threat requiring proactive measures is the potential impact of quantum computing on cryptography.
Right. Quantum computing, it sounds very futuristic, maybe even sci-fi.
Yeah, how does that translate into a cybersecurity threat we need to think about today?
Well, the concern revolves around the potential development of what's called a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, or CRQC.
CRQC.
Such a machine, if built, would have the capability to break many of the current public key encryption algorithms that we rely on for securing vast amounts of sensitive data transmitted across networks or stored securely.
So the encryption keeping our online banking, confidential emails, sensitive stored data safe, that could potentially be broken by a powerful enough quantum computer.
Exactly. That's the fear. And while a CRQC isn't here yet, we don't think cryptography standards need to be developed and implemented before that capability exists. It takes a long time for new algorithms to be standardized, for software to be updated, systems to migrate.
You can't wait until the house is on fire to buy insurance.
Precisely. So to address this, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, recently released 3 initial post-quantum cryptography standards, PQC standards.
Okay, so these new standards are essentially creating encryption methods that are designed to be resistant to attacks from future quantum computers. It's a necessary, forward-looking safeguard.
Exactly. It's about securing our information for the future, trying to stay ahead of the curve. And speaking of proactive measures and dealing with this rapidly evolving threat environment, the materials consistently stressed one critical recommendation: the importance of collaboration.
Information sharing and working together, you mean? Between organizations.
Yes. Organizations like Health ISAC emphasize that sharing threat intelligence, best practices, lessons learned, it's absolutely crucial for effectively defending against these sophisticated and interconnected threats. Attackers collaborate, defenders must too. No single organization has the complete picture or resources to tackle this alone.
Makes sense. Strength in numbers.
Yeah.
Okay, let's transition now to one of those specific high-impact threats we saw rise in the rankings for 2025, zero-day exploits. We hear the term zero-day a lot. Let's really break down what it means and why it's so dangerous.
Okay. At its core, a zero-day refers to a security vulnerability or flaw in software or hardware that has been very recently discovered and is, crucially, unknown to the software or hardware vendor.
Unknown to the good guys.
Right. The term zero-day comes from the idea that the vendor has had 0 days to fix the flaw because they didn't know it existed until it was found, perhaps by an attacker, or maybe very recently reported by a researcher.
So it's a secret weakness that the vendor doesn't know about. And how does that weakness turn into a zero-day attack? You mentioned there's a sequence there: vulnerability, exploit, attack.
Yeah, that sequence is key to understanding it. The zero-day vulnerability is the hidden flaw itself. Maybe a mistake in the code that allows unauthorized access, or lets someone run code they shouldn't. A zero-day exploit is the specific piece of code or technique that attackers create to take advantage of that newly discovered vulnerability. It's the weapon.
Okay.
And a zero-day attack is when that exploit is actively used against a target system to achieve a malicious goal, whether that's stealing data, installing malware, or disrupting operations using the weapon.
So the attackers discover the secret flaw, build a tool to use that flaw to break in, and then use the tool to launch an attack, all before the vendor knows what hit them.
Exactly. And the significant danger lies in the fact that because the vendor and the vast majority of the security community are unaware of the vulnerability, there are no existing security patches, no updated defenses, and often no specific detection signatures designed to stop that particular exploit.
They have the element of surprise.
Complete surprise. Often, these attacks are delivered by tricking a user again. Social engineering comes up, convincing them to click a malicious link, open a weaponized document, maybe visit a compromised website. The exploit then runs silently in the background, leveraging the unknown flaw.
Because the attackers are the ones who found the flaw first, they have a period where their attack is essentially invisible to standard defenses. Who is typically behind these kinds of attacks, and what kind of systems and targets do they go after?
The actors vary significantly, driven by different motivations. We see cyber criminals looking for financial gain, stealing credit card numbers, bank logins, or deploying ransomware. There are hacktivists who use 0 days to promote a political or social cause by disrupting systems or leaking embarrassing information.
Okay.
Current espionage groups might use them to spy on competitors or steal valuable intellectual property. And increasingly, state actors engage in cyber warfare, using 0 days to attack critical infrastructure or government systems in other countries.
So a wide range of motivations. And what kind of systems are vulnerable to these unknown flaws? Is it just Windows or common software?
Unfortunately, the potential attack surface is vast. 0-day vulnerabilities can exist in almost any piece of software or hardware that runs code. This includes major operating systems like Windows, Mac OS, Linux, web browsers, common office applications, the open source components that underpin vast amounts of modern software, hardware, firmware, and even Internet of Things, IoT devices. If it has code, it could potentially have a 0 day.
Wow. So basically everything, which means the potential victims are incredibly broad too.
Precisely. Victims can range from individual users simply running vulnerable software on their home computer, to large businesses and organizations holding vast amounts of customer data, to government agencies managing critical infrastructure, and politically sensitive targets. We can differentiate between targeted attacks, which go after specific high-value individuals or organizations, maybe a specific CEO or a defense contractor,
Right.
and non-targeted attacks that might simply exploit a 0 day in a widely used piece of software, like a web browser, affecting anyone who happens to be using that software. These often result in mass compromise or widespread data collection.
So they are stealthy, potent, and can be used against a wide range of targets and systems. Given all that, how do security professionals even begin to detect or defend against something that, by definition, they don't know exists? It sounds almost impossible.
That's the core challenge of 0 days. There's no single easy answer, and it's incredibly difficult. One approach involves using databases of known malware and their characteristic signatures or behaviors.
Like antivirus definitions.
Yeah, but the limitation there is obvious. A 0 day attack is new, so it won't match known signatures. A more effective, albeit still imperfect, technique is behavioral analysis.
Behavioral analysis, how does that work differently? What's it looking for?
Instead of just scanning the code of an incoming file or looking for a specific pattern of bytes that matches known malware, security systems using behavioral analysis monitor how a file or process interacts with the system after it starts running, in a sandbox or even on the live system sometimes.
Okay, so what it does, not what it looks like.
Exactly. Does it try to access sensitive system files it shouldn't? Does it attempt to connect to unusual IP addresses known to be malicious? Does it try to modify core system settings or encrypt files? If its actions deviate significantly from a baseline of normal, safe behavior, it might signal an unknown threat, including a potential 0 day exploit attempt.
So it's less about recognizing the specific look of the malicious code and more about recognizing suspicious actions once the code is running, catching it in the act.
Precisely. It's focusing on the intent or effect rather than the signature. Machine learning is playing an increasingly important role here, analyzing massive amounts of data on past system interactions to build a more sophisticated and dynamic understanding of what constitutes safe behavior versus suspicious behavior. Detection often relies on a hybrid approach, combining multiple techniques, constantly looking for anomalies.
Even though they are initially secret, once 0 days are discovered and patched, they become known incidents. Can you share a few notable historical examples that illustrate their impact, just to make it more concrete?
Certainly. Google Chrome, despite being a widely used and generally pretty secure browser, has experienced multiple zero-day threats over the years. For instance, back in 2021, several zero days were discovered and actively exploited, stemming from bugs in its V8 JavaScript engine. They required users to apply urgent updates immediately.
I remember those Chrome updates popping up urgently.
Yeah. Then in 2020, a vulnerability in Zoom's software allowed attackers to potentially access a user's PC remotely. And if the user had administrator privileges, the attacker could potentially take full control.
That's concerning, especially with how widely Zoom is used now. That was a big deal during the pandemic height.
It highlighted the risk in collaboration tools, absolutely. Even systems often considered highly secure aren't immune. Apple iOS, for example, has been targeted by multiple zero-day vulnerabilities. In 2020, one particularly nasty exploit allowed remote compromise of iPhones without any user interaction at all, just by sending a malicious iMessage.
Wow, a no-click 0 day. That's the most dangerous kind, right? You don't even have to trick the user into doing anything.
Indeed, very dangerous. Other examples include a 2019 attack that used a local privilege escalation 0 day in Microsoft Windows to gain higher access on targeted government institutions in Eastern Europe. In 2017, a 0 day in Microsoft Word was linked to attacks that stole banking credentials. Victims opened a seemingly innocuous document, were prompted to allow remote content, and clicking yes triggered the exploit.
And arguably the most famous, or maybe infamous historical example, Stuxnet.
Stuxnet. Discovered around 2010, it was a highly sophisticated worm that utilized multiple zero-day vulnerabilities simultaneously to target Iran's nuclear program. It infiltrated manufacturing computers running specific Siemens industrial control software, manipulated the programmable logic controllers PLCs controlling centrifuges to cause physical damage.
Actually breaking things in the real world.
Exactly. And all while providing false feedback to the operators, making it seem like everything was running normally. Stuxnet was a huge wake-up call that 0 days could be used for kinetic effects in the physical world, not just cyber ones.
These examples really drive home that 0 days are a critical threat because they bypass known defenses. So beyond relying on behavioral analysis, what are the primary mitigations when a 0 day is discovered and patched? What should organizations and individuals do?
Well, once a patch is released by the vendor, applying it immediately is the absolute top priority. Patch Tuesday becomes Patch Immediately Day.
Right. Don't wait.
Don't wait. Reducing your software footprint only using applications you actually need helps narrow the potential attack surface. Fewer apps means fewer potential 0 days. Maintaining robust network defenses like firewalls and intrusion detection prevention systems can help detect suspicious activity even if the exploit itself is unknown. And crucially, user education remains vital, as many zero-day attacks are still delivered via social engineering tactics that rely on tricking an individual into clicking that link or opening that file.
So layered defenses are key. Technical controls plus user awareness.
Absolutely. And comprehensive security software that uses that behavioral analysis we talked about is a key part of that layering.
Okay, now let's connect this idea of vulnerabilities in software, especially third-party software, back to something we identified as a top concern for 2025. The rising threat of supply chain attacks. This threat vector is deeply intertwined with how modern software is actually built, isn't it?
It truly is. To understand supply chain security in the software context, you need to think about the entire process of developing, building, and deploying software. In today's world, very little software is built entirely from scratch by one company. It relies heavily on libraries, frameworks, and components that were developed by other people, other organizations, or are part of huge open-source projects.
So when my organization builds an application, that application is actually a complex structure built upon foundations and pieces created by thousands, maybe millions of other developers and entities, like building with Legos made by countless different factories.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
Exactly. You're inheriting code, and with that code, you could potentially inherit vulnerabilities or even intentionally malicious code. The scope of software supply chain security involves evaluating and securing all those external components, those Lego bricks from other factories that are used throughout your software's entire life cycle.
Hmm.
From the moment code is written to when it's deployed and updated. You need to ensure those components don't contain known malware, unknown vulnerabilities, or deliberate backdoors.
And the reports clearly show this isn't just a theoretical exercise in caution anymore. This is happening.
How far from theoretical?
Mm.
According to one report from 2022 that was referenced, software supply chain attacks had increased by a staggering 742% in just 3 years.
742%. Wow.
That number alone highlights how quickly this has become a primary focus for attackers. It's a huge attack surface.
And we've seen some major headline-grabbing incidents. SolarWinds is probably the most well-known recent example, right?
The SolarWinds attack is a classic, albeit terrifying, illustration. A sophisticated state-sponsored group apparently infiltrated SolarWinds' development environment and inserted malicious code into a seemingly legitimate software update for their network management platform, Orion.
Something sysadmins use all the time.
Exactly. This poisoned update was then distributed to thousands of SolarWinds customers, including numerous U.S. government agencies and Fortune 500 companies. By simply installing a regular trusted software update, these organizations unknowingly installed a backdoor that gave attackers persistent access to their networks.
So the attackers didn't have to breach each target individually. They compromised one vendor upstream in the supply chain and effectively got access to all that vendor's downstream customers through a trusted channel.
Precisely. It's a massive force multiplier for the attackers. Hit one, reach thousands. Another example was Operation Shadowhammer back in 2019, where malware was distributed to millions of ASUS computers through a compromised ASUS software update server, again, poisoning the well. And there have been broader geopolitical concerns raised about the security of network equipment and software from companies like Huawei, and the potential for state actors to exploit vulnerabilities inserted during the development or manufacturing process. The whole supply chain, hardware, and software.
So securing the supply chain means protecting not just your own code, but rigorously vetting and monitoring every piece of external code you use and the infrastructure used to build and distribute your software. It's end-to-end.
It requires vigilance across the entire ecosystem. Robust supply chain security practices are essential for thwarting attacks, minimizing their impact if they do occur, and preventing vulnerabilities from making their way into final applications in the first place. It's also becoming increasingly important for compliance. For example, recent U.S. government mandates, like Executive Order M2130 and associated NIST guidelines, require enhanced secure development practices for software sold to the government, specifically addressing supply chain risks like SBOMs and secure build processes.
Okay, let's just formalize the definition of a supply chain attack in this software context. What does it boil down to?
At its core, a software supply chain attack involves targeting a vulnerability or weakness at any point within the software development and delivery pipeline. That could be during initial coding, testing phases, through compilation and packaging, all the way to distribution and installation on the end-user system. The goal is always to inject malicious code or somehow compromise the integrity of the legitimate software. Once that malicious element is integrated and executed, maybe when the software is built or installed or updated, it can carry out its intended function, whether that's stealing data, disrupting operations, or gaining unauthorized control over the system.
And what are some of the most common ways attackers manage to get into that supply chain in the first place? What are the popular attack vectors we're seeing?
The reports highlighted several common methods. Targeting vulnerabilities in third-party components those libraries and frameworks developers rely on is a really frequent vector. Attackers might find a zero-day or a known but unpatched flaw in a widely used open-source library and exploit that.
Find a weak link in the chain.
Exactly. They could compromise development tools themselves, like compilers or build systems, to inject a malicious code as part of the normal build process. That's insidious. Compromised developer accounts, perhaps on code-sharing platforms like GitHub or package registries like NPM or PyPI, are another significant risk. If an attacker gains control of a trusted developer's account, they can easily insert malicious code into legitimate projects.
Because the code comes from a trusted source, seemingly.
Right. Targeting software update infrastructure, as we saw with SolarWinds and ASUS, is a direct way to distribute malware broadly. And, as always, social engineering can be used against developers or employees involved in the pipeline to trick them to giving up credentials or running malicious code, providing that initial foothold.
It sounds like a complex, interconnected system with many potential weak points. Very difficult to secure completely. So, drawing from the materials, what are the key best practices organizations should be implementing to try and mitigate these risks? What actually helps?
There are several critical practices highlighted. One significant one is mitigating dependency confusion attacks. This is a common and often surprisingly easy vector for attackers to exploit.
Dependency confusion, that sounds complicated. What exactly does that exploit? How does it work?
It leverages the way many software projects manage external code dependencies, particularly when an organization uses a mix of privately developed internal code packages and publicly available open source packages. Many package managers like npm for JavaScript or pip for Python are configured by default to search for dependencies in both internal private code repositories and external public code repositories like npm.js or PyPI.
Okay, they look in both places.
Right. Attackers exploit this by uploading malicious versions of packages to these public repositories. These malicious packages often use names that are identical or very similar to legitimate but private or internal packages used by target organizations. This is often achieved through typo-squatting, like registering a package name like CoffeeScript, hoping someone meant to type CoffeeScript.
Ah, like typo domain squatting, but for code packages.
Exactly. Or by just guessing the names of likely internal packages based on company naming conventions.
Ah, I see. So if an organization's build system or developer environment is configured to maybe pull the newest version of a package automatically, and the attacker uploads a malicious version with the same or a very similar name, but a higher version number to a public repo, the build system might inadvertently pull the malicious public one instead of the legitimate internal one, thinking it's just a newer update.
Precisely. The build tool sees the newer version number in the public registry and assumes, oh, this must be the one I should use. The mitigation strategies referenced in the materials involve using scoped namespaces for packages, which ties a package name explicitly to a specific user or organization, making it harder to substitute a public package accidentally, like at my company internal package.
Okay, that makes sense.
Another key step is using repo-specific configurations for package managers like npm or pip. This allows organizations to explicitly define which upstream registry should be used for which packages or scopes. So you can say, only ever pull packages starting with at my company from our internal repository, never from the public one.
Got it. Explicit routing.
Exactly. It ensures private packages are only ever pulled from the designated internal repository and not accidentally requested from public ones, or vice versa. The materials noted that configuring this correctly can be surprisingly complex, though, and requires careful attention to detail to avoid mistakes that could still lead to compromise.
Yeah, sounds like something easy to misconfigure. You need to be very deliberate and explicit about where your software components are coming from. Okay, what's the next key practice?
Disabling arbitrary install commands by open source packages. This is a big one. Some package managers, notably npm for Node.js, have features that allow packages to execute scripts or commands automatically as part of the installation or uninstallation process. These are called install scripts or lifecycle scripts.
So malicious code could run on your system just by installing the package before you even explicitly use it in your code.
Exactly. While intended for legitimate setup tasks like compiling native code or downloading binaries, this capability can be easily weaponized by malicious packages. This is another vector often used in conjunction with typo-squatting or dependency confusion. A malicious package could execute commands to download further malware, exfiltrate environment variables or credentials, maybe map the internal network, all the moment it's installed.
Yikes, that seems like a huge security hole.
It can be. The recommendation is to vet packages rigorously before installing them, perhaps using tools like SnickAdvisor or socket.dev tools mentioned in the materials to assess their health, known vulnerabilities, and trustworthiness. And importantly, where possible, configure package managers to restrict the execution of these arbitrary scripts during installation unless absolutely necessary and explicitly approved using flags like ignore scripts.
Preventing unexpected code execution during installation seems like a fundamental security principle, doesn't it?
It truly is. Third, and this is absolutely critical, enabling multi-factor authentication, or MFA, across your entire software supply chain ecosystem is paramount. We keep coming back to credentials. Given the reliance on open source contributions and interconnected platforms like code repositories and package registries, securing the accounts that have access to these platforms is vital.
You'd think developers, who are generally quite tech-savvy, would be early adopters of MFA, especially considering they're building the software that needs protection. You'd hope so.
You would assume so, but one report from January 2020 cited in the materials noted that less than 10% of developers on npm.js, which is a huge JavaScript package registry, had enabled MFA at that time, despite the feature being available since 2017.
Less than 10%. That's
Yeah.
startlingly low.
It is. And it represents a significant gap in protection. MFA should be enabled, ideally enforced, on accounts across all critical platforms involved in your supply chain package registries like NPM, PyPI, RubyGems, code hosting platforms like GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, container registries like Docker Hub, and any other systems used in the build or deployment process. CI/CD systems, too.
Because a single compromised developer account with weak authentication could potentially lead to malware being injected into hundreds or thousands of projects, impacting countless downstream users. The blast radius is huge.
It's a high-leverage target for attackers.
Yeah.
Easy path in sometimes. The fourth key best practice is rigorously avoiding the exposure of sensitive information throughout the software supply chain. In the collaborative and often public or semi-public nature of modern software development, it's surprisingly easy for confidential data to leak out.
Like accidentally hard-coding API keys or passwords directly into the code and pushing it to a public repository on GitHub. That happens, right?
That is a classic and unfortunately still frequent mistake. Sensitive information, API keys, secrets, database credentials, private certificates, even customer data samples used for testing should never be stored directly within code. Configuration files committed to repositories or potentially exposed in build logs. You need secure secret management solutions.
Right.
Similarly, exercise extreme caution not to package or include any sensitive information in software packages or container images that are published to public registries. Platforms like GitHub and NPM offer specific security practices and tools, like secret scanning, to help prevent these kinds of leaks, but developers need to be constantly vigilant. Once sensitive information is leaked publicly, it's almost impossible to fully retrieve or render it harmless. It's out there.
These sound like concrete, actionable steps organizations can implement to significantly harden their software supply chains. How does this concept of supply chain security relate to other areas like application security or AppSec and DevSecOps? Are they the same thing?
They are all interconnected and complementary concepts working towards the broader goal of creating secure software and systems. They aren't the same, but they overlap and support each other.
Okay, break it down for us.
So, supply chain security, as we've been discussing, is specifically focused on ensuring that the components you use to build your software and the process by which you build and deliver it are secure and trustworthy. Think of it as ensuring the ingredients are safe and the assembly line isn't sabotaged.
Got it. Ingredients and assembly line.
Application security, or AppSec, is broader. It's about securing the software itself against vulnerabilities, things like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, XSS, insecure direct object references, securing the systems the application runs on, and ensuring the data it processes is protected both in transit and at rest.
So the final product and where it lives.
Right. And DevSecOps is more of an operational or cultural approach. It's about integrating security practices, mindsets, and automation early and throughout the entire software development lifecycle, SDLC. Making security a shared responsibility for development, security, and operations teams, rather than just something tacked on at the end by a separate security team doing a final review. Shifting security left.
Okay, using an analogy. If you're building a house, supply chain security is making sure the timber isn't rotten, the nails aren't defective, the concrete mix is right, and the delivery trucks bringing the materials aren't tampered with.
Good on.
AppSec is making sure that the house's structure is sound, the doors and windows have good locks, the electrical wiring isn't faulty, and the plumbing doesn't leak.
Yep.
And DevSecOps is having the architect, the builder, the electrician, the plumber, and the security consultant all working together from the blueprint stage onwards, constantly checking each other's work for safety and security throughout the build.
That's an excellent analogy. It perfectly captures how they work together. There are different layers and perspectives on building a secure product or house. And making all of this manageable, especially with the complexity of modern software with thousands of dependencies, heavily relies on automation. You can't do it manually.
Right. How does automation help specifically with supply chain security? What can be automated?
Automating various security tasks and checks within the supply chain significantly increases efficiency, effectiveness, and consistency. It reduces the reliance on manual processes, which are prone to human error and just don't scale. This includes things like automated vulnerability scanning of components using tools that check dependencies against known vulnerability databases, like CVEs.
Finding known bad stuff in your ingredients.
Exactly. Automated dependency management helps track what versions of components you're using across all your projects and can alert you instantly when new vulnerabilities are disclosed in those specific versions you rely on. Automated supply chain analysis tools can go deeper, identifying risks like components coming from untrusted contributors, having unusual permissions, or exhibiting suspicious changes over time. And automated configuration management helps ensure the build and deployment systems themselves are securely configured according to policy. Infrastructure as code scanning, for example.
Automation can scan thousands of components and dependencies much faster and more reliably than any human ever could, flagging issues almost as soon as they appear in a database or a new build.
Absolutely. It's really the only way to keep pace with the sheer volume and complexity of modern software supply chains. Another tool mentioned that's becoming increasingly important, especially with regulatory pressure, is the Software Bill of Materials, or SBOM.
An SBOM? What is that exactly? Sounds like a recipe.
That's a great way to think of it. It's basically a formal, usually machine-readable inventory of all the components, including open-source libraries, third-party commercial software, even internal components that are used to build a particular piece of software. It lists the ingredients and often their versions and relationships. It's essentially a complete, detailed ingredients list for your software product.
And what's the value of having that detailed ingredient list? Why is it useful?
The primary value is transparency and enabling much faster response to vulnerabilities. If a new critical vulnerability is discovered and disclosed in, say, a specific version of the Log4j library.
Oh yeah, everyone remembers Log4Shell.
Exactly. With an accurate SBOM, you can quickly query across all your software products. Do any of these use Log4j version XYZ? You can understand your exposure almost immediately and prioritize patching efforts where needed. Without an SBOM, organizations were scrambling for days or weeks just trying to figure out if and where they were using the vulnerable library.
Right. It turns a potentially manual, days-long fire drill discovery process into something much faster and more accurate.
Precisely. And tools can automate the creation of these SBOMs during the build process and then use them to continuously scan for newly disclosed vulnerabilities within the listed components. It's becoming a foundational element for proactive vulnerability management within the supply chain.
Okay, having that clear, accessible inventory makes responding to newly discovered vulnerabilities in third-party code much more efficient. It seems essential. This comprehensive look at the threat landscape, 0 days, and these supply chain risks provides really essential context for the real-world incident we wanted to examine next, the data breach involving Ocuco.
Yeah, the Ocuco case study is unfortunately a powerful illustration of how these various threats can converge in the real world. Ocuco is an Ireland-based software provider that serves the eye care industry globally. They provide clinical software, dispensing software, practice management software, very embedded in that sector.
Okay, so healthcare adjacent, handling sensitive patient data.
Exactly. Their position in this sector and their global reach make them a relevant target for the kinds of threats we've just been discussing.
And they recently became the victim of a ransomware attack, is that right?
Yes. According to information referenced in the reports, the attack was carried out by the KillSec ransomware group. Ocuco apparently became aware of a claim by KillSec on a dark web leak site around April 1st, 2025, indicating that data had been stolen from them.
Okay, so the attackers announced it publicly first. How did Ocuco respond when they discovered this claim?
Their reported response was immediate action. They moved to secure their environment and launched a comprehensive investigation with the assistance of external cybersecurity experts, which is standard best practice. Their investigation determined that the attackers had gained unauthorized access to 2 non-production servers.
Non-production servers. Okay, that might limit the immediate operational impact, maybe.
Potentially, but data could still be there. The key finding was how the attackers got in. Ocuco stated access was achieved by exploiting a vulnerability in third-party software that Ocuco was using on those specific servers. Critically, they noted that this vulnerability in the third-party software had not been timely disclosed to Ocuco by the third-party vendor.
Ah, there it is. So it wasn't necessarily a vulnerability in Ocuco's core software initially, but in software they used that was provided by someone else. And sounds like it might have been effectively a zero-day from Ocuco's perspective, or at least a very recently discovered, unpatched vulnerability in that third-party component within their supply chain.
That description strongly aligns with that type of scenario, a weakness introduced via an external component, exploited before Ocuco had adequate warning or perhaps a patch available from the third party. Ocuco stated they have since patched this specific vulnerability on their systems and implemented additional security measures to prevent recurrence.
Okay. What was the impact of this breach in terms of data? What did the attackers claim? And what did Ocuco's investigation reveal about the scale? How much data? How many people?
The KillSec group claimed on their dark web leak site to have stolen a significant amount of data, over 340 gigabytes, comprising over 670,000 files and 26,000 folders. That's a substantial claim.
Huge amount of files.
Yeah. However, one report noted that while the data was listed, it wasn't confirmed to be actually available for download from the KillSec site at that specific time. Sometimes these claims are inflated or delayed. Ocuco's official notification provides the scale based on their review of the compromised data on those non-production servers.
And Ocuco filed a breach notification with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, right? Which is a standard requirement when protected health information of U.S. individuals is involved.
They did, filing on May 30th, 2025. That official filing indicated the breach potentially impacted nearly 241,000 individuals.
Nearly 250,000 people. That's a substantial number from just 2 non-production servers. What types of sensitive information belonging to those individuals were potentially compromised?
The data types listed are highly sensitive and fall into multiple critical categories. This included personally identifiable information, PII, such as names, contact details, dates of birth. It also encompassed protected health information, PHI, including medical records, insurance records, and details about medical procedures related to eye care.
So really sensitive health data.
Yes. Furthermore, financial data, including financial account numbers, social security numbers, and driver's license numbers, were also potentially compromised, according to the notification. The combination of PII, PHI, and financial data, especially SSNs, is particularly toxic and increases the potential harm to affected individuals, significantly raising risks of identity theft, financial fraud, medical fraud, and severe privacy violations.
Okay, let's get a better understanding of the attacker in this case, the KillSec group. What do the materials tell us about them? Are they a known quantity?
KillSec is characterized in the reports as a ransomware group that often adopts a hacktivist narrative or guise. They sometimes frame their attacks with political justifications, perhaps targeting specific countries or industries they claim to oppose. However, their core motivation and methods align squarely with financial gain, typical of most ransomware operations.
So the political angle is more of a strategic tool for them, maybe to get attention or apply pressure, rather than a genuine ideological stance.
That's the analysis provided a guise used for financial purposes and amplified pressure. Their modus operandi involves double extortion, encrypting victim systems to disrupt operations and stealing sensitive data to use as leverage, threatening to leak it publicly if the ransom isn't paid. The public narrative, political or otherwise, just adds to the pressure on victims.
Makes sense. What about their entry methods and targeting?
Their initial access methods often involve common vectors like phishing or exploiting vulnerabilities in third-party platforms or public-facing applications, which aligns perfectly with Ocuco's description of how they were breached via third-party software. They strategically target organizations that are likely to feel significant pressure from downtime or data leaks, or those with high media visibility. This includes governments, critical infrastructure, and, as we see here, healthcare.
How active has KillSec been overall? Are they a major player?
According to external tracking mentioned in the reports, KillSec has been active since at least the fall of 2023. They officially announced a ransomware as a service offering in June 2024, suggesting they're recruiting affiliates to conduct attacks using their tools, sharing the profits.
The RansomHub, yes.
Yeah.
Spreading the capability.
Exactly. Their public leak website has listed a total of 208 victims across various sectors since they began operating.
And was healthcare a particularly favored target for them based on that list?
Yes. Healthcare was listed as their top targeted sector, with 29 documented victims on their leak site. Geographically, their primary targets appear to be organizations in the U.S. and India. An interesting detail noted in the reports was the average delay between the actual attack occurring and when KillSec publicly lists a victim on their leak site, averaging around 297 days.
297 days, that's like 10 months.
Yeah, a really long delay. This suggests there can be a significant lag between initial compromise, maybe negotiation attempts, data analysis, and the eventual public shaming if a ransom isn't paid. Victims might not even know they're on the list for a long time.
Okay, now it's crucial to point out something you mentioned earlier. While the KillSec breach of Ocuco involved a vulnerability in third-party software used by Ocuco, the materials also highlighted another separate specific vulnerability found in Ocuco's own software. Is that right?
That's a very important distinction to make clear, yes. Separately from the KillSec incident analysis, a critical authentication bypass vulnerability, identified as CVE 2024-41197, was discovered in a specific version of Ocuco Innovation software, specifically the nvclient.exe executable, version 2.0.24.5. This vulnerability received a high CVSS score of 9.8 out of 10, indicating severe risk.
A 9.8? That's about as bad as it gets. An authentication bypass sounds serious. How does this particular CVE work?
It allows an attacker on the network to send a specially crafted TCP packet, essentially, a custom-designed message over the network to the vulnerable software component running on a workstation. This crafted packet apparently tricks the software, allowing the attacker to bypass the standard authentication process entirely and escalate their privileges on the system, potentially gaining administrator-level access.
Bypassing authentication and escalating privileges to administrator level just by sending a network packet. That sounds like it could lead to complete system compromise of any machine running that software version.
It does. The potential impact is significant, including full system compromise and potentially unrestricted access to any data stored on or accessible from that workstation. The mitigation recommendations provided for this specific CVE were standard. Apply the vendor patch as soon as Ocuco makes it available. In interim, use network defenses like a web application firewall, WAF, if applicable, or an intrusion detection prevention system, IDSFU, to potentially spot the malicious packets and ensure regular system monitoring and updates are in place.
And just to reiterate for absolute clarity, based on the materials we looked at, this specific CVE 2024-41197 is distinct from the vulnerability in the third-party software that Ocuco identified as the entry point for the KillSec breach. They aren't directly linked in the information we reviewed, correct? It's not like KillSec used the CVE?
That is correct. The information describes them as separate findings. The CVE is a vulnerability found in Ocuco's own software product that organizations using that specific version might need to address by patching, whereas the KillSec breach entry point was identified by Ocuco as originating from a vulnerability in third-party software they were using internally on their non-production servers. It just highlights that organizations face potential risks from vulnerabilities in both their own developed code and the external code they incorporate or use from others. Risk is everywhere.
Okay, so Ocuco was impacted by the KillSec group via a third-party software vulnerability, affecting a substantial number of individuals and sensitive data. Separately, a critical vulnerability was found in a specific version of their own software product. What steps is Ocuco taking post-breach regarding the KillSec incident, and what are the potential legal repercussions they face now?
Ocuco stated, they are conducting a detailed review of the compromised files from those two servers to precisely identify all individuals whose information was involved. Based on that review, they plan to notify all affected individuals and relevant regulatory parties and provide resources to help protect personal information in accordance with applicable laws and regulations. For instance, the U.S. IPA breach notification rule requires notification to HHS and affected individuals within 60 days of discovery for breaches impacting 500 or more people. Their HHS filing met that timeline.
Okay, standard procedure then. And the legal side. We saw mention of potential lawsuits. Is that typical?
Yes, very typical in breaches of this scale involving sensitive data. The reports noted that a class action lawsuit is being investigated by the law firm Class Action U on behalf of the individuals potentially affected by the Ocuco breach. This is a common consequence of large data breaches involving sensitive personal and health information. Affected individuals often seek legal recourse for potential damages, like costs for credit monitoring, time spent dealing with identity theft, and to hold the breached organization accountable for potentially failing to adequately protect their data. It adds a significant layer of complexity, cost, and reputational damage to responding to a breach long after the technical incident is contained.
This brings us to the broader and critically important topic of data breach notification obligations, especially considering regulations like GDPR in Europe, which Ocuco, being an Ireland-based company, would be subject to, alongside U.S. regulations like IPA for their American clients' data. Handling data across borders gets complicated fast.
Understanding these regulatory obligations is absolutely fundamental for any organization that handles personal data, particularly across different jurisdictions. They aren't optional. Under GDPR, for example, the definition of a personal data breach is quite broad. It's defined as a security incident leading to the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, or unauthorized disclosure of or access to personal data.
So it's not just deliberate hacking or data theft. It includes things like accidentally emailing a spreadsheet with personal data to the wrong person, losing a laptop with unencrypted data, or even ransomware encrypting data and making it unavailable because that impacts availability.
Exactly. It's any security incident that negatively affects the confidentiality, integrity, or availability, the CIA triad of personal data. Not every minor security hiccup reaches the threshold of a reportable personal data breach under GDPR. But if personal data is impacted in one of those ways due to a security failure, the obligations kick in pretty quickly.
And the primary obligation in jurisdictions like Ireland, governed by GDPR, is to notify the Data Protection Commission, the DTC, right? The
Yeah.
regulator.
Yes, that is the default requirement. A controller must notify the competent supervisory authority, like the DPC in Ireland, of any personal data breach, unless the breach is unlikely to result in a risk to the rights and freedoms of the individuals whose data was affected.
Unlikely to result in a risk. That sounds like a judgment call.
It is, but the guidance suggests the threshold for not notifying is intentionally quite high. You need a solid, documented justification to determine there is unlikely to be a risk. If there's doubt, the recommendation is generally to notify.
And there's a very strict timeline for this notification, right? Something like 72 hours.
That's correct. Notification should be made without undue delay, and where feasible, no later than 72 hours after the organization becomes aware of the breach.
And aware means when the clock starts ticking.
Generally interpreted as having achieved a reasonable degree of certainty that a security incident has occurred that has led to personal data being compromised. It doesn't necessarily mean you know every single detail, but you know enough to confirm a breach impacting personal data happened.
Okay. What if you can't meet the 72 hours?
If you notify after that 72-hour mark, you must provide a justified reason for the delay along with the notification. The regulation does allow for information to be provided in phases if a full investigation takes longer, perhaps as more details emerge. But even then, the initial notification and subsequent updates must be done without undue delay.
And what about companies that just process data for others, like cloud providers?
They have obligations too. Data processors who handle data on behalf of controllers have their own obligation under GDPR to notify the controller without undue delay after becoming aware of a breach affecting the controller's data. This allows the controller to meet their own 72-hour deadline for notifying the authority.
And accountability is key. Even if a breach is deemed low risk and doesn't require DPC notification, organizations still have to keep a record of it internally. They can't just ignore it.
Absolutely not. Controllers must document all personal data breaches internally, regardless of whether they notify the DPC or not. This internal breach register should include the facts relating to the breach, its effects, and the remedial actions taken. This is a crucial part of demonstrating compliance with GDPR's accountability principle. Regulators can ask to see this log.
So that's notifying the regulator. There's a separate and often more impactful from a public relations standpoint obligation to communicate directly with the individuals whose data was involved.
Yes, that's a distinct requirement under GDPR and often under other laws like HIPAA as well. Under GDPR, you must communicate the breach to the affected data subjects without undue delay, if the breach is likely to result in a high risk to their rights and freedoms.
Okay, so the threshold is higher for notifying individuals. It has to be a high risk, not just a risk, like for the DPC notification. What constitutes high risk?
High risk usually involves factors like the type and sensitivity of the data compromised, e.g. health data, financial data, SSNs, credentials, the volume of data, the likelihood of malicious use, and the potential consequences for the individuals. For example, identity theft, financial loss, discrimination, reputational damage. A breach involving encrypted data where the key wasn't compromised might be low risk, while a breach involving unencrypted PHI and SSNs would almost certainly be high risk.
What's the main goal of this direct communication to individuals?
The purpose is primarily to enable the affected data subjects to take necessary precautions to protect themselves from the potential consequences of the breach. Informing them allows them to be vigilant. This communication should also be done without undue delay, especially if there's an immediate risk they need to mitigate, such as needing to change passwords or monitor bank accounts urgently.
Are there any exceptions where an organization might not have to notify the individuals directly, even if it's technically a high-risk breach?
Yes, The regulation lists a few specific exceptions. First, if the organization had already implemented appropriate technical and organizational protection measures before the breach, such as strong encryption, that rendered the compromised personal data unintelligible to anyone who gained unauthorized access. If the data was effectively useless to the attacker, notification might not be needed.
Okay. Encryption saves the day, potentially.
Potentially, if done right, and the keys are safe. Second, if the organization has taken subsequent measures immediately after the breach that ensure the high risk to individuals' rights and freedoms is no longer likely to materialize. Maybe they remotely wiped lost devices or quickly invalidated stolen credentials before they could be misused.
Got it. Quick action averted the high risk.
Right. The third exception is if communicating individually would involve disproportionate effort, perhaps due to the sheer number of affected individuals being in the millions, or the difficulty in obtaining accurate contact information. However, this isn't a free pass. In this third case, a public communication or similar equally effective measure, like prominent website banners, press releases, is still required to inform the data subjects collectively.
So you can't just avoid communication entirely. You need an equally effective way to get the information out to the public if direct notification is genuinely too difficult. And what information must be included in that direct communication to the affected individuals, whether it's individual or public?
The communication must describe the nature of the personal data breach in clear, plain language. No technical jargon or legalese that people won't understand. It must include the name and contact details for where individuals can get more information, such as the organization's data protection officer, DPO, or a dedicated support line. It must describe the likely consequences of the breach based on the data involved. It needs to detail the measures taken or proposed by the controller to address the breach, including measures already taken to mitigate potential adverse effects. And crucially, it must provide recommendations for the data subject on steps they can take to mitigate potential negative impacts on themselves.
Things like advising them to set up fraud alerts on their credit reports, monitor bank statements carefully, be wary of follow-up phishing attempts pretending to be related to the breach, maybe change passwords on other sites if credentials were lost.
Precisely. Providing clear, actionable advice is a key part of fulfilling this obligation properly. And it's worth noting, as a final point here, that even if an organization determines a breach doesn't meet the high-risk threshold legally requiring communication to data subjects, they are still free to notify them voluntarily if they believe it's in the individual's interest or appropriate for transparency and maintaining customer trust. Sometimes it's better to over-communicate.
Right. Bringing it back to the Ocuco case, they're filing with HHS in the U.S., and their stated plan to review data and notify individuals and relevant parties aligns with these types of regulatory requirements, whether they're operating under HIPAA for U.S. patient data or GDPR for European operations. They're navigating these complex processes designed to ensure accountability and, importantly, inform those potentially affected by the compromise of their very sensitive data.
It really underscores that the consequences of a data breach extend far, far beyond the initial technical incident. They involve navigating complex legal frameworks, regulatory scrutiny, managing public relations, and dealing with potentially significant communication challenges, especially when dealing with data across international borders. It's a massive undertaking.
This has been a really deep dive into a complex but absolutely vital set of topics shaping the cybersecurity landscape today. A lot to take in.
Indeed. We've seen how the healthcare sector remains under significant pressure from increasingly sophisticated cyber threats, with ransomware and increasingly supply chain attacks standing out as major concerns projected for 2025. We've broken down zero-day vulnerabilities, understanding why their unknown nature makes them particularly dangerous because they bypass existing defenses, at least initially.
And the Ocuco incident serves as a very timely and frankly sobering real-world example. It illustrates how ransomware can impact critical sectors, how vulnerabilities lurking in third-party software can serve as devastating entry points within the supply chain, and the significant scale of sensitive personal and health data that can be exposed, affecting hundreds of thousands of individuals.
It highlights the non-negotiable need for organizations to prioritize robust security measures, not just within their own core systems and code, but across their entire software supply chain. This includes fundamental practices like timely patching of all software, mandating multi-factor authentication everywhere possible, being extremely careful about how sensitive data is handled, stored, and exposed, and implementing technical controls like automated vulnerability scanning, dependency management, and maybe even adopting SBOMs.
And for organizations handling sensitive personal data, understanding and rigorously complying with data breach notification requirements, whether under GDPR, IPA, or other relevant regulations globally, isn't just a bureaucratic hurdle. It's crucial for legal compliance, demonstrating accountability, and most importantly, helping affected individuals protect themselves from the downstream impacts of their data being compromised. It's part of the responsibility of holding that data.
Ultimately, navigating this complex and evolving threat landscape requires continuous vigilance, constant learning, the implementation of layered technical controls, robust processes, and a deep understanding of the legal and regulatory obligations that come with handling sensitive information in today's digital world.
So what does all of this mean for you listening right now? These sophisticated threats, these 0 days, these intricate supply chain attacks, and their real-world consequences, like the Ocuco breach, they aren't just abstract headlines happening in some distant corporate office or government agency. They directly affect the healthcare providers you rely on, the businesses that hold your personal and financial information, and the fundamental security of the interconnected digital world we all live and work in. Understanding how these attacks happen, where the vulnerabilities lie, and how organizations are, or frankly should be, defending against them is absolutely crucial to understanding your own digital safety, your privacy, and the resilience of the services you use every single day.
Yeah, it reinforces the idea that cybersecurity is no longer just confined to the IT department basement. It's a systemic challenge that impacts every facet of modern business and personal life. We're all part of this ecosystem.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting and perhaps a bit provocative to leave you with. Given the exponential growth in the complexity of software built on countless layers of third-party and open-source components sourced from literally around the globe, is it genuinely possible for any organization, even with the best intentions and the most robust practices like SBOMs and MFA, to achieve anything close to perfect security across their entire software supply chain? Or are we entering an era where the sheer scale and interconnected complexity means some level of inherent vulnerability is almost inevitable? Does that force us to shift our focus even more heavily towards rapid detection, resilient response strategies, and minimizing the impact when, not if, breaches inevitably still occur?
That's a profound question, isn't it? And it's one that security professionals, software developers, and business leaders are wrestling with daily. The challenge is immense. And maybe perfection isn't the right goal anymore. Maybe it's resilience.
Resilience. A powerful thought to consider as you navigate your own digital life. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the shifting tides of cybersecurity. Navigating this complex landscape requires strong foundations, and we want to once again thank our sponsor, Stonefly. They are a leader in secure enterprise storage, backup, and disaster recovery solutions, including those critical ransomware-proof, air-gapped, and immutable storage options, which are absolutely crucial components of any effective defense strategy against the types of threats we've explored today.
Definitely key pieces of that resilience puzzle. To learn more about how Stonefly can help provide that critical resilience for your organization, you can contact them at sales@stonefly.com to schedule a demo.
That's sales@stonefly.com. Thanks for diving deep with us today. We'll catch you on the next one.